So just a quick note before we go on. You'll notice that instead of 4 strands, in 2010, when the Common Core was first adopted, there were 4 strands, and there was a language strand, a standalone language strand. And when teachers met in 2017 to review and revise the 2010 standards, there was a lot of discussion around wanting to make sure that language was being taught explicitly and in a context, within a context, so that it was being taught explicitly, but within a context of student writing. It was being taught explicitly within a context of here you see this language in action and something that we're reading. And it's being taught explicitly within a context of speaking and listening. We were working on a speaking and listening task with students. And so language is not missing from the standards. In fact, it almost plays more of a prominent role because it is embedded within each of these 3 strands. And the expectation is that it's still being explicitly taught, but within a context of writing, reading, or speaking and listening. So just in case you were wondering about that, that's the reason, and language is still there. It's still extremely important. And okay, so let's move on. So there was a shift from previous standards in 2010 to the standards that were adopted in 2010. It's represented here. And it's a paradigm shift, really. And on the top half of the slide, you'll see sort of what they define as the old paradigm of how we thought about learning to read and reading to learn. There was this thinking that students spent a lot of time in early grades learning to read, and the focus was not so much on gaining knowledge from what students were reading. That they spent a lot of time learning to read, and then there was sort of a cutoff point around 3rd or 4th grade where they were expected to know how to read, and then from that point forward, they were reading to learn. The paradigm shift in 2010 is shown below on the lower half of the slide. And it's this idea that yes, students in the early grades spend more of their time learning to read. It's more of a focus learning to read because they haven't yet acquired those skills, but they also can read to learn. And they can read to learn through interacting, engaging in, for example, read-alouds with informational text, or reading very simple informational texts that allow them to gain knowledge. So really a focus on gaining knowledge through their reading is the shift. And then you'll also notice on the upper end that there's still acknowledgement that even in the upper grades, there's still some room for learning to read. That as readers, even experienced readers and even advanced readers, that we are still in some ways learning to read complex texts. So this is a model that appeared in the 2010 standards about text complexity. They envision text complexity as a 3-parted triangle. And the 3 parts of the triangle are quantitative, qualitative, and then reader and task. So the quantitative features of a text include things like a lexile level, which can be looked up on lexile.com. You can usually, if you have a novel or a book, you can just type in the title and it will give you a lexile level for that title. You can also go to lexile.com, and if you have a passage, you can copy and paste that passage into a box and it will give you a lexile level for that passage. There are other measures of quantitative complexity. There's ATOS. Different companies have their own way of denoting quantitative complexity. And usually it has to do with the kinds of words that are in that passage or that book, sentence length, paragraphs, all that kind of stuff. Things that can be quantitatively measured. Those are the features that comprise the quantitative complexity of a text. But we know that's not the only thing that we want to look at when we're judging whether something is too complex or complex enough or not complex enough for our students. The qualitative features of a text include things like levels of meaning. If there are a lot of extended metaphors, for example, that students might find difficult to understand, that text might be a relatively qualitatively demanding text, or it might have a lot of qualitative complexity for students. If a text requires a lot of background knowledge or knowledge of a certain region, those are things that can make a text more qualitatively complex. And then also just language demands. So, for example, if there's a lot of dialect in a text, or if it's written from another time period when there was a lot of language that we don't use today, those are qualitative features that can make a text more complex. And then finally, there's this issue of reader and task. So if you think about the task that you are wanting students to engage in with a particular text and who your readers are. Those are things that, of course, all good teachers think about. These are my readers, and this is what I want them to do with this text. But they're definitely things that we need to take into consideration when we're thinking about text complexity and whether or not a text is appropriate for a task and for our students. In the standards, this has not changed since 2010. They talk about writing purposes across the grades, and this is just a note about what percentage of the kinds of writing that students should be doing from grade to grade. So, for example, in grade 4, that about 30% of student writing should be to persuade. In other words, it should be persuasive writing, about 35% to explain, explanatory text, and then about 35% to convey experience or perhaps a narrative text, personal narrative, or just storytelling, another kind of narrative. And then 8th grade, sort of increasing a little bit in the persuasive area. And by the time students get to 12th grade, about 40% of their writing should be to persuade. And in 12th grade, by the time students get to 12th grade, it's they call it argumentative writing. So there's a lot of attention paid to creating an argument, making a claim, finding supporting details to back up that claim. About 40% of their writing should be to explain, explanatory text, and then only about 20% to convey experience or narrative text. Similarly, they lay out some percentages having to do with reading, and for reading, they suggest that in 4th grade, about half of the reading that students do should be literary in nature, and about half of the reading that students do should be informational. And then by 12th grade, about 30% of the reading students do should be literary and about 70% informational. What is interesting about this is they say that this pertains to reading that students do across the school day, across the entire school day. So it's interesting to think about because in 4th grade, a student is much more likely to have the same teacher throughout the school day. And so he or she can generally keep a closer watch on about how much literary text and about how much informational text is being instructed, our students being instructed in. Whereas by the time students get to 12th grade, it becomes a little bit more difficult. And many teachers say that, well, most of the texts that students read in 12th grade in their science classes, social studies classes, other classes will be informational text. But something that you have to remember is, or question, I guess, is are they receiving instruction in reading those texts? And if yes, then that is great. But if not, if they're being assigned those texts and they're not being instructed in how to read those texts, then the English language arts teacher who probably is teaching quite a bit, probably carries the whole of the literary text load, which seems appropriate, but they may need to weave in more informational text as well if students are not receiving actual reading instruction in those informational texts in the other content areas. All right, and we're going to stop again for a quick knowledge check.